48 hours after the Japanese launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbour, their aircraft delivered an equally devastating blow to the Royal Navy. On the 10th of December 1941, the warships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were sunk by torpedoes launched by Japanese aircraft. It was the first time that warships defending themselves and sailing in open water had been sunk solely by an air attack, and it would change naval warfare forever. Before we get to that date in December 1941, when the British lost 2 warships and over 800 men, I want to explain how we arrived at that momentous event 50 miles off the Malayan Peninsula. Whilst Britain had been concentrating on fighting Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, events on the other side of the world were taking a decided turn for the worse. The Japanese had been embroiled in a war in China since 1937. It would eventually result in the deaths of somewhere in the region of 20 million people. As the war had intensified, along with international condemnation, the Japanese had started to cast their eyes towards the resources of Southeast Asia that could both aid their war effort and make them immune from any sanctions applied by the USA, not least the oil in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, and rubber and tin in the British-controlled Malaya. In September 1941, the Japanese occupied the French colony of Indochina. Concerns in both London and Washington were further raised when the moderate Prime Minister of Japan was replaced by the hardline General Tojo on the 16th of October. The outbreak of war between Japan and the USA and the British Empire in December 1941 was not as much as a surprise as some people think, or we've been led to believe. In the weeks preceding the attack, the British ambassador in Washington, Lord Halifax, was aware that ciphers were being burned and secret messages sent to both the Japanese embassy in the USA and also to London. Certainly something was afoot, although exactly what, where and when was still unclear. Nevertheless, through the autumn of 1941, the British government had been watching events with growing alarm. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was keen to send a fleet to Singapore to deter any further Japanese aggression. However, the strategic imperative for Britain at this time was the defence of the British Islands and operations in the Mediterranean. So in the end, all that could be spared was the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, and the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable, which was serving in the Caribbean. They would join up with some destroyers already at Singapore to form Force Z, under the command of Admiral Tom Phillips. Built at the Camel Laird shipyard in Birkenhead, HMS Prince of Wales was still being fitted out when war was declared, and it wasn't until March 1941 that she was ready for service. In the 7 short months that she'd been on active service, HMS Prince of Wales had fought the Bismarck, taken Winston Churchill to meet President Roosevelt at the famous Atlantic Charter meeting, and most recently had participated in Operation Halberd, escorting a convoy from Gibraltar to Malta, during which operation her anti-aircraft guns shot down 3 Italian planes. That operation, where the Italians had failed to sink a single ship whilst losing their planes, may well have influenced the actions of the ship's captain John Leach and Admiral Phillips in December 1941. John Leach had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, for his actions against the Bismarck. On the 25th of October 1941, HMS Prince of Wales, with a top speed of 28 knots and carrying a crew of nearly 1,500, left home waters for Cape Town and then on to Singapore. She was joined by HMS Repulse. The Repulse had a much longer history than the Prince of Wales, having been launched in 1916. The renowned class battlecruiser had seen action at the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight in 1917 and during the Norwegian campaign at the outset of the Second World War. Whilst faster than the Prince of Wales with a top speed of 31 knots, she was by now starting to show her age, but nevertheless, her 3 twin 15-inch guns could still pack a punch. Her captain was William Tennant. A month short of his 52nd birthday, Tennant, who was born in Upton upon Severn in Worcestershire, had already had a very active war. This was the man who was the senior naval officer ashore at Dunkirk, organising the evacuation. He'd been given command of HMS Repulse in June 1940, and his crew of 1,100 men had nicknamed him Dunkirk Joe. Together, they had seen action against the German warships Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. Tennant would go on to supervise the construction of the Mulberry Harbours and the laying of the Pluto fuel pipeline under the English Channel during the Normandy campaign in 1944. The Prince of Wales and the Repulse arrived at Singapore on the 2nd of December 1941 and formed the nucleus of Admiral Phillips's Force Z, along with 4 destroyers. Now you might be wondering where the aircraft carrier was. Well, unfortunately she had run aground off the coast of Jamaica and was now in dry docks for repairs. It's one of those interesting what-if questions, to wonder what might have happened had she been present on the 10th of December 1941. But she wasn't. In the last week of November 1941, British and American intelligence noticed an increase in Japanese shipping and a build-up of forces on Hainan Island off southern China and in French Indochina. The problem was neither the British nor the Americans were sure where the intended target was. In late November, intercepted Japanese diplomatic ciphers indicated that Tokyo intended to do something drastic in the coming weeks. On the 3rd of December, the British learnt that an order had gone out to destroy materials at the Japanese embassy in London, and the following day, the same message was received by the Japanese mission in Washington. The decoded cipher also suggested that the Japanese were asking Hitler and Mussolini to declare war on the USA if Washington supported Britain in whatever action was about to be taken. So all the danger signs were pointing at Malaya and Singapore rather than Pearl Harbor. In fact, the US Congress inquiry into Pearl Harbor in 1946 stated that, quote, just about everybody was blinded by what seemed to be the self-evident purpose of Japan to attack towards the south, unquote. What no one envisaged was an attack in both directions. But as we now know, that was exactly what was about to happen. With the arrival of Force Z in Singapore on the 2nd of December, the British could put into place their plans to prevent a Japanese attack by themselves occupying southern Thailand, therefore preventing the Japanese from doing so. But the British commander in Malaya, Air Marshal Brooke Popham, held back. There was, after all, nothing to specifically say Malaya was about to be attacked. Under those circumstances, authorising an invasion of neighbouring Thailand could have some very serious implications, not least it might drive Thailand into the Japanese camp. And so, the waiting game continued. Unbeknown to the British, the Japanese invasion fleet had left Hainan Island on the 4th of December, and for the next 48 hours it travelled south along the coast of Vietnam without being detected. It was only at around midday on the 6th of December that an Australian scout plane from the airbase at Kotubaru in Malaya spotted the convoy heading west off the southern shores of Indochina. Due to stormy weather, the plane had to turn back, and the British lost contact with that Japanese fleet. From its bearing, it seemed to be heading northwest to either Japanese-controlled Cambodia or possibly towards the Thai capital of Bangkok, rather than Malaya. The convoy wasn't located again until about 24 hours later, on the 7th of December. By now they'd spread out, but they were heading westwards, towards the north of Malaya, and also the Kra Isthmus just across the border in Thailand. By midnight on the 7th of December, they'd reached their destinations off the Thai and Malay coasts. At 1:15 a.m. on the 8th of December, Japanese forces landed at Kotubaru on the Malay coast. Because of time zones, it was 7:15 a.m. on the 7th of December in Honolulu, 7,000 miles to the east. 30 minutes later, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor began. So in a little realised piece of history, the Japanese launched their attack on the British 30 minutes before they attacked Pearl Harbor. 3 hours after their invasion of British territory, the Japanese launched an air raid on Singapore, killing 61 people, mainly civilians. None of Admiral Phillips's ships were damaged. By now, the main Japanese landings were taking place 100 miles north of Malaya, in neutral Thailand. However, thanks to their initial landing at Kotubaru, the Japanese had eliminated the RAF's most northern airfield. Consequently, the RAF were denied the ability to easily attack the landings in Thailand. More importantly for our story, it also denied HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse vital air cover just a few days later. Despite lacking air cover, Admiral Phillips decided to take offensive action against those Japanese landings. His decision would prove fatal. However, we do have the tendency to judge historical events with the benefits of hindsight. Up until this moment in warfare, no ship defending itself on the high seas had been sunk by an air attack alone. HMS Prince of Wales had experienced futile air attacks on the convoy that she had recently protected in the Mediterranean, and the ships sunk by aircraft at Dunkirk and Norway had been stationary. And whilst the Fleet Air Arm had successfully torpedoed the Italian heavy cruiser Pola at the Battle of Cape Matapan, it was 2 British destroyers that had finally sunk her. If there was a danger to his ships, it was more likely to come from the Japanese fleet than from the Air Force. Meanwhile, the Japanese were landing troops up the coast ready for the invasion of Malaya, and Phillips was sitting at Singapore with the Prince of Wales and the Repulse at his disposal, along with the destroyers HMS Electra, HMS Express, HMS Tennant, and the Royal Australian Navy destroyer HMS Vampire. Under those circumstances, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On the evening of the 8th of December, some 12 hours after those initial Japanese landings, Phillips and Force Z steamed out of Singapore, heading for the Japanese landing zone on the Kra Isthmus in Thailand. On the 9th of December, his fleet was spotted by a Japanese submarine, who shadowed them for the next 5 hours, reporting their presence. Whilst Phillips was unaware that they were being observed, more obvious was later that afternoon when several Japanese scout planes flew overhead. With the element of surprise lost, Phillips decided to withdraw back to Singapore. But as he sailed south in the early hours of the 10th of December, Phillips now received reports that the Japanese were landing at Kuantan, even further down the Malay Peninsula and even closer to Singapore, and so altered course to intercept them. However, when a seaplane launched by catapult from HMS Repulse reported that the landing site was empty, the Admiral turned his fleet away from the coast and continued his withdrawal to Singapore. All this time, he'd kept radio silence to maintain what element of surprise he might still have, especially with any Japanese warships. Unfortunately for him, his presence had now been spotted by another Japanese submarine, and his enemy were scrambling bombers to seek out his fleet. And those Japanese pilots, just like their counterparts at Pearl Harbour, had been training for just such an opportunity, practicing releasing their torpedoes from just 30 feet above the sea. And that training was about to pay dividends. Just after 11 o'clock on the morning of the 10th of December 1941, 8 Japanese Nell bombers appeared in the skies above the British ships, and all 8 now attacked HMS Repulse. Despite that concentration of planes and bombs, the British battlecruiser only received 1 hit, causing minor damage, whilst her anti-aircraft guns damaged 5 of the attackers. She continued on her course at a speed of 25 knots. Just over 20 minutes later, 17 Japanese Nell torpedo bombers arrived on the scene. 8 attacked the Repulse, whilst the other 9 went for Admiral Phillips's flagship, HMS Prince of Wales. Once more, the Repulse managed to avoid any damage, and the Prince of Wales shot down 1 enemy plane and damaged 3 more. It seemed that the experiences of Captain Leach on his convoy to Malta were not a one-off. And then disaster struck. A single torpedo hit the Prince of Wales in her stern. She rapidly started to take on water and began to lose power. Furthermore, that flooding started to make the battleship list, preventing many of her anti-aircraft guns from being elevated to defend her. With the loss of power and damage to her propeller shaft from the torpedo, her steering became less responsive. At 12:20, a third wave of Japanese bombers appeared. 26 Betty bombers released their torpedoes, 3 of which hit the ailing Prince of Wales on the starboard side. Meanwhile, HMS Repulse, which up until now had managed to dodge 19 torpedoes, was finally hit on her port side, and then swiftly by 3 more torpedoes. Captain Tennant calmly announced on the ship's tannoy, "Prepare to abandon ship. May God be with you." It took less than 15 minutes for HMS Repulse to sink beneath the waves. All this time, the Prince of Wales remained under attack, and her list to port became more pronounced. HMS Express now rushed to her aid. Coming alongside, the wounded and the non-fighting crew were ferried across to safety, and then the order to abandon ship was given. At 1:18 p.m, she turned over and sank stern first. With the Japanese aircraft having departed, HMS Electra and Vampire started to pick up the men in the water from the sunken Repulse, whilst HMS Express continued to rescue men from the Prince of Wales. It was around now that Buffalo fighters from 453 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force arrived above the scene of destruction. Due to Phillips's radio silence, they had only been alerted to the Japanese attacks by Captain Tennant when the attacks had started. Caught completely on the hop, it had taken them 2 hours to get airborne and then to locate Force Z. It was too little, too late. Having completed their mission beyond their wildest dreams, the Japanese planes had flown home. 840 British sailors were lost, along with the 2 ships that should have been the deterrent to the Japanese invasion. Amongst those lost were Admiral Phillips and the captain of HMS Prince of Wales, Captain John Leach. In return, the Japanese had lost just 3 planes. It was the first time that ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power in the open sea. The days of battleships ruling the waves were dramatically over. In the space of just 48 hours, the Japanese had changed the strategic balance of power in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The loss of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, along with the damage inflicted on the US fleet at Pearl Harbour, had effectively cleared the seas between, Africa and California of any significant naval opposition to the Japanese, apart from the 3 aircraft carriers who'd been absent from Pearl Harbour. And that enabled them to continue their lightning conquest of Southeast Asia. Further seaborne landings took place in the Philippines within 2 weeks, and in early 1942 the Japanese commenced their attack and occupation of the Dutch East Indies. Meanwhile, the troops that had landed on the eastern coastline of Thailand moved across the border into British Malaya. On the night of the 11th, 12th of December, they broke through the British and Indian lines at Jitra, and within a month had taken Kuala Lumpur. The British retreated back towards the island of Singapore, where they were forced into a humiliating surrender on the 15th of February 1942. But that story is for another show, which is coming very soon, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. In the meantime, why not watch another one of my programmes? There are over 200 to choose from. You can support my show as well by becoming a member or a patron, details in the description below. Thanks for joining me today, keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.